Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad that you could all join us today. I see the attendee list continues to grow in a manner of keeping up with everybody's time. I want to get started, but I'm thrilled to have so many of you with us today, and I hope that you and everybody in your world are all doing well and remaining safe through everything that continues. My name is Josh R. Cole. I'm here today representing the Council on Compulsive Gambling of Pennsylvania. And as I've mentioned before in our previous webinars, which I know many of you have participated in, our goal is to continue offering these web-based events for you throughout the entire crisis and then beyond that. But the effort here is being made to help us all stay connected. Obviously, we're doing it for you, but we're doing it for ourselves as well. So please continue to just keep an eye out for email updates. We're trying to put together programs continuously. And as they're announced, we will certainly be sending out emails. We actually sent one out this morning with new programs that are coming up with details and ways to register. So please continue to keep an eye out for those emails. You can also always check the events page on our website, which is www.pacouncil.com. You can get more information there as well. As for the council, I've gone over this a couple of times, but for those of you who have not been through any of our programs over the past couple of weeks, in short, we're a nonprofit advocacy group. And basically our focus is on assisting individuals or the family members of individuals who are experiencing issues related to gambling. And the primary way that we do this is by connecting folks through with help through our statewide helpline, which can be accessed either by calling 1-800-GAMBLER, or it can be accessed by our chat feature or our text feature that are both available on our website. This 24/7 live service that we offer, it connects folks with tools and resources all across Pennsylvania, and things like counseling options and places where they can go to get assistance, or maybe find a meeting, a self-help meeting like Gamblers Anonymous or Gam-Anon, somewhere where they can go to get more information and basically just get the help that they need so badly. And if any of you have any questions about the council or any of the things that we do or the work that we do, you can always reach out to me directly after the webinar. You can get my contact information as well as a whole host of other resources and downloadable information on our website. Today, I'm thrilled to have with us Trish Caldwell, who's going to take some time this afternoon to focus on the importance of self-care, obviously, as the title suggests. And this is something that obviously is always very important in the work that we all do, but in current times, it's just absolutely vital to take some time to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. Trish joins us today from Recovery Centers of America, who I just need to mention, they have very graciously offered to sponsor today's program. So a very, very big thank you to Recovery Centers of America for the work that they do and for the help that they've provided in terms of supporting a program like this one. Trish serves as the Corporate Director of Family Services at RCOA, and she brings a tremendous amount of experience, not only as counselor, but also in terms of education to today's program. And what we hope is that today's going to offer some tips and some strategies to help all of us maintain our mental well-being as we continue to navigate our way through these really challenging times. It's tough. It's been challenging. It continues to be. We all, I'm sure, have had some good days. We've all had some rough days. Sometimes we have good moments followed by rough moments. So as we continue to navigate our way through this, we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to bring you as many tools as possible. And again, we're all in this together. So we're trying to maintain as much normalcy as we can and to take care of one another. We're going to leave a few minutes at the end of the workshop to answer any questions that you may have. So as you go through the program, if you have questions, what we ask is that you just write in anything that you'd like to ask in the chat box. It's available on, it should be available on your browser. And what we'll do is review them all at the end of the session. Once again, we will have a very brief post-webinar quiz and survey that will be available following the program. Should be made available immediately following. And basically this survey needs to be completed and passed in order to meet CE requirements. So for those of you who are seeking continuing education credits, this is something that needs to be completed. I'm gonna go over that a bit at the end of the program. So if you have any questions, we can go over that at that time. But without any further delay, I'm gonna let Trish take over from here. I'd like to welcome Trish and thank her for her time today. And I look forward to to hearing, having some time to chat with all of you later on in the program. Trish, if you are there,
I am.
Yours. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. As you heard, can you hear me? Josh, are you still able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My phone is, or my computer's saying I've been muted, but it doesn't show that it is. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't talking and then you'd be like, what?
Nope, it looks all good from here.
Sounds good. All right, so I appreciate everybody participating in today. I think this is one of those topics that today more than ever, so we need to have these conversations. I will say I'm a little non-conventional in the regards to the way that I view self-care, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit differently than maybe you've heard in the past, and how we can utilize some of these same concepts that we need to engage in order to be able to be better serving for those that we're also working with, particularly during these times. So there, I had kidded around with Josh earlier. I don't have the webinar on, so I don't have the video capacity right now. So in case anybody is wondering, so that is what I look like. I am a real person. Somebody had asked me that in the very beginning. How do we know that you're real? I'm like, because you can see my face. So there I am. I am the Corporate Director of Family Services at Recovery Centers of America. We are an inpatient and outpatient treatment facility for substance use. So we have currently 7 inpatient facilities, 2 in the state of Massachusetts, 2 in the state of Maryland, 2 in the state of New Jersey, and 1 in the state of Pennsylvania. And we serve for those that are 18 and above for substance use disorders or co-occurring disorders. And then we have outpatients for all of ours. So my role is to not only ensure that we are engaging families in a way that is respectful and responsible in regards to substance use treatment, but also to help our staff in understanding these kind of concepts in regards to how do we take care of ourselves in an effort to be better equipped to take care of those. I am trauma informed, and I've helped to facilitate RCA becoming a trauma informed organization. So that's where this idea of self-care and resiliency is really important to me, not only as somebody that works at RCA, but really as a provider for somebody that works, daily with those that we have chosen to see and serve. So the objectives are right here. Again, for any of you that have maybe seen a training that I have done in the past, objectives are everything that I'm going to go over. So there's no need for me to go over that slide. So I'm going to skip it. So I think today it becomes incredibly important for us to talk about a new way of understanding self-care when we understand it through this pandemic, right? So we hear the words social distancing. A lot of us have changed that terminology to talk about, staying socially connected, but physically distancing, because we really want to honor that language does make a difference. And we want to make sure we're spreading the right messages, that we work in a population that can be incredibly vulnerable at times like this, that in the recovery world, connection and community is such an overwhelming part of recovery. So the idea of having people feel that there's this social distancing is incredibly difficult. Now, what I also know is that when I speak with clinicians, when I speak with my friends who are clinicians, I am a clinician and having my own private practice as well, is I'm feeling those subtle changes. I'm feeling the pain associated with not being able to physically be around family members and not being able to be around community members that I feel connected to and feel like help me kind of stay regulated. And what makes this pandemic so unique, which is why I think we're really seeing these changes for all of us. And I'm going to be kind of using today as an opportunity for us to figure out how do we utilize that oxygen mask for ourselves in order to be able to continue to provide the services for those that we're serving. So what is so interesting and unique about this pandemic is that in history, we have seen things that have been very trying to our communities, that have been very trying to us as a nation, and certainly even globally. What's different about this is that during those incredibly difficult times, what brought us together was actually the social connectedness. And so this is creating a different barrier. So I've spoken to a lot of people that are saying, I'm tired. I'm more tired now working from home than when I was working 60 hours a week. And I don't understand why. And that's what we're going to start looking at. When I start having conversations about this idea of self-care, I do say, and so for those of you that have attended self-care, some of you might be trainers on self-care, I'm all for it. But it's one of those trainings that I'm always like, oh my gosh, they're going to tell me more things that I'm not doing right. Like, I don't want to go to a training and have somebody tell me that I need to work out more, or I need to do yoga, or I'm already dealing with my own stuff. I don't want to feel bad about not wanting to do some of these other things. So we're going to look at this a little bit differently, but the connection, irregardless, is something we have to pay attention to. And that's really what has been different about this pandemic versus what we've seen in other natural disasters. That today we have this new norm. So we're seeing an increase in isolation. We're seeing an increased impact that it has on families. So I know at RCA, I'm in the process of creating a parenting and recovery, because there's so many families now in newly recovery that are having to struggle with, how do I take care of my kids full time while I am in this new recovery? And recovery can be from anything. It can be mental health, it can be from gambling, it can be from substance use, and now I'm having to school them, and I'm having to be a part of somebody 24 hours a day. So we're seeing these impacts on families. We're seeing this increase of people working from home. And for those that are working from home, there's kind of this frustration of being home. And for those that are not working at home, it's creating its own change in the experience. So there's two different ways of experiencing this, and we're not even able to share those all the time. So those that are feeling, working from home and feeling stressed, feel guilty about sharing that with somebody that might be working as an essential employee. And those that are essential employees are saying, I wish that I could work at home. So it's creating, again, that disconnect that we really want to make sure that we're honoring and bringing out for not only ourselves, but for those that we're working with. That the outlets that we've had are gone. So gym and working out, so all of these things that we might have been doing for ourselves has decreased. So whether it was attending church or spiritual services, whether it was going to the gym, whether it was attending in person AA, thinking of a handshake, thinking of a shared cup of coffee, there were so many things that have changed, that these new norms, and right now we don't know when this norm will end. And that is when we start talking about how stress impacts us. This is where we're starting to notice, again, these continued effects on how we're processing through that. And then, without saying, even again, acknowledging something greater, is that we're seeing higher rates of unemployment. What we're also noticing is that as the unemployment rate increases, statistically speaking, the last research that I read, it was saying 3 times as much substance use was increasing. So it's finding that, again, this balance, and we'll integrate it in regards to how this is impacting those that have either experimented or have been gambling, certainly with substance use. But we're looking at all of these variations of how we are moving through this pandemic. So when I had mentioned that I do self-care a little bit differently, this is really why. That individuality oftentimes get lost when we start to talk about self-care. So when we start to look at, so how are we feeling and what are we feeling? Oftentimes we just feel something and we don't really know why. But is the combination of isolation and stress due to the COVID-19, right, making you feel more depressed and alone or anxious? Is being with your family causing you and your family the stress of togetherness? Or, which is really significant, is the family togetherness and this pause from normal life giving you a greater sense of belonging and balance? So now here's 2 very different things. So similar to what I was saying with those that are working from home and those that have lost their jobs, and then those that are the essential employees. We're experiencing this differently because we are actually individually different. So some people are using this as an opportunity to kind of reset. And you hear people say, I'm going to pause, I'm enjoying this time with my family and I'm resetting myself and reprioritizing. But this same situation for somebody else is creating an increased amount of stress and depression, an increased amount of family conflict. So why? That the individuality of figuring out who are we in this process, that are you looking to hit this restart button and grow from this, or are you just looking to survive the day? That becomes a really important foreground to what you're going to start doing to try and help yourself. that when I spoke to somebody, and so I do have a very small private practice, and I touched base with everybody during this, obviously. And when I reached out to one of them, what she said was, Trish, I'm an introvert. This is the greatest thing that could have happened to me. She's certainly not negating the pandemic. And so I'm certainly not minimizing the experience of what's been happening to the world. But for her, having to be alone and inside her home, she's actually feeling a decrease in depression and anxiety because she doesn't have to go out. She doesn't have to attend school. She can do cyber school. She doesn't have to attend her therapy group sessions because she can do them online. So for her, the individuality, the introvert, is feeling better. If you're an extrovert, then this is hard. If you are an employee, and again, this becomes incredibly important because again, that oxygen mask needs to be put on you before you can then take care of those that you are serving. But for some who have been working 40, 50, 60 hours a week and now are at home, their lives at home were adjusted with them only being home for a small period of time. And there's nothing wrong or right about any of these. It's just an acknowledgement. So now we're seeing increases of depression and stress and conflict because somebody that was hardly in the home is now in the home 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the family is having to reorganize and the relationship. So it becomes an incredibly important person that before you look at what do I need to do to take care of myself, you need to ask yourself, who am I? Am I an extrovert? Am I an introvert? And now how do I find my own balance? Because what can happen is people can continue to shame themselves. I know I should feel like I'm going to find something, right? And you hear people, and if you're looking on social media, people are going to post their next project being done. And so then there's shame that people are like, I can't get a project done. I'm just trying to get through the day. And so it's a recognition of like, where are you in this experience? And now how do you need to take care of yourself so that you can nurture yourself so that you can continue to be a provider in a way that allows for you to fill your own tank before you start to work towards somebody else filling theirs. So in managing our expression, you're going to see, or our experiences, this is where we're going to kind of focus in. I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain, but are needing to find balance. So as we see this increase in anxiety and depression and fear and isolation, are we noticing how are we balancing on this other side? Are we engaging in things? Are we able to find time with our family? So if we're somebody that is loving this because we're able to find time for the family, then that's terrific. And if we are feeling, I can't do this and I don't want to spend all this time with my family, then that's also okay. And that you can start setting up appropriate boundaries for you. I've shared with a lot of people, if you are just able to spend 10 minutes with your family, play a simple game. I was speaking to somebody and they said, where I started playing Monopoly. I'm like, who wants to play Monopoly on a good day that we're already stressed? So Monopoly is like a 17-hour game. Start small. Start with a game of Uno. Start with a game of Go Fish and build off of the resources and the resilience before you start to overwhelm yourself and then start feeding into these negative interactions. So we're going to look at how we can manage and find this balance. I want to talk a little bit about stress and the way, again, that this is impacting our nervous systems. So again, I'm a little bit different in the way that I discuss self-care because I think that it's important for us to recognize and appreciate having this pandemic right now is a stressor to our nervous system, all of us. It impacts us in different ways based on other vulnerabilities, based on other stressors in our lives, based on the environmental factors that might be happening in or out of our home. But stress in and of itself is not the enemy. Stress is where, so when we talk about resilience, when we talk about how do you build your own resilience, how do you prevent burnout, stress in and of itself is what you need to build resilience. It's the opportunity for you to figure out how to be able to handle something and then trust your competence in doing so. When we don't attend to how it's impacting us, what happens is that we can become overwhelmed by it. And then it starts to turn into an unhealthy stressor. It actually can start shifting our nervous system, which then increases the likelihood of us having those experiences, the vulnerabilities to the expressions of our depression, anxiety, any of those factors. So it's an important piece to just recognize that you better be aware of the stressors. So I, again, was speaking to one of the other individuals that I had been working with who was expressing that I feel like I'm doing really well with the pandemic, but I'm noticing that I'm really irritable all the time. And so helping to tease out that it can be both, that you can be doing well, but recognizing and appreciating that it's still stressful to your nervous system. So we don't need to go into crisis in order to acknowledge that our nervous systems are just being impacted by something that's unknown, by what is considered now today's normal norm. So in looking at stress, the two different ways that we can understand stress that either increase or decrease our vulnerability or increase or decrease our resilience. So predictable stress, right? That when we start to look at it, for those who we work with who are more vulnerable, we might see them engaging in higher risk behaviors. We'll talk a little bit about that. But in order to build resilience, what you are seeing is that we need to start to create these structures, these rituals. We need to be more attentive to our sleep and our diet and the way that we wish to connect. So it doesn't mean that we need to be around people all the time. If we are an introvert, if we are an extrovert, it means we need to attend to it more because it's going to have a greater impact on us. That in order to build resilience, it's finding what you can control and then creating predictability in that. So if we think of structures, that if you are now working, it's setting up realistic expectations to how to set up your structure. So again, for somebody else that I had been working with who was struggling with just, and this was a clinician, that she was saying, some days it's just hard for me to get up and get showered. Some days I just want to lay in bed all day. I'm really struggling. And then what happens is that she beats herself up over it. So while she's attempting, there's this very fine line between self-care and avoidance. And so when she's acknowledging, and that's what we talked about, if you can acknowledge that today is a hard day, then you might need to change the structure or the ritual for that day. Instead of setting up for the rest of the day, how about you just make your expectations more predictable and more likely that you can build confidence? So how about you just allow yourself to lay in bed for the extra hour or 2 hours, but acknowledge that this is relaxing for you. If you're shaming yourself the entire time, then your nervous system is still being very reactive. So it's these subtle changes that allow for us to create balance. Because with prolonged stress that is not attended to, you're going to expect more fatigue, you're going to expect a decrease in the focus, and you're going to notice that you are more irritable. So when you notice those symptoms, notice that your physiology is being impacted, and then we're going to talk about strategies to do those things. So that's what we had just talked about, the prolonged stress during times like these. Individuals are faced with unpredictability and a lack of regular structure. And as a result, we experience this prolonged stress that starts to trip the fight or flight part of our brain, which can change our brain state. So when you notice this after weeks and weeks that you're more irritable and you're more tired, and then this is an acknowledgement that that prolonged stress is starting to take a toll on you, and that you need to start putting investments in balancing your nervous system differently. So the more reactive and activated we are, the less rational we become. The lower parts of our brain are not as logical. So when you notice yourself getting irritable, and I'll share a personal story, right? So I travel a lot, and now I'm home 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I noticed on one of these days, so I can't help that I have these physiological experiences. I can't help that there's different changes, but I noticed on one of the days that my daughter was just eating her cereal, she was annoying me. She was literally just eating her cereal. And I was like, are you serious? You got to chew that loud? And that was my indication that I was becoming irrational and that I needed to deposit for myself. I needed to recharge myself, because in order for me to continue to be present for everybody else, I need to make sure I'm being present for myself. So fear's impact on resilience. So how we think, how we feel, and what we do is determined by what happens in our brain. So I am going to talk a little bit about this idea of bottom up or top down. Our brains develop from the bottom up, and I'm going to show that in a second and talk about that. And so it's hierarchical, with the lower parts of the brain being responsible for more basic functions, right? And the highest part. So when you are in a good mood, when you can be rational, when you can think through the choices of your actions, then you are at the higher part of your brain when you are reacting much more emotionally, right? I've had people that were sharing with me that they're watching TV now and they just keep crying, that they're watching commercials and they're crying, that it's showing them, and if that's different for them, that it's telling them, it's a sign that your emotional part of your brain is being more activated, and that it just means there's no judgment to that. It just means do more self-care. So I always like to explain, I do a lot of trainings on trauma. And so I always use this as like the idea of like your brain develops from the bottom to the top. At the very bottom is that brain stem. So this is the most instinctual part of your brain. Then there's the limbic system. And the limbic system is the emotional part of the brain. What we're noticing today, and this is where self-care starts, what we're noticing today is that this system is being more and more triggered and activated. That when you're worried about what's going to happen with COVID-19, when you're worried about your job, when you're chronically being faced with feeling isolated, or if you're feeling like you're more conflicted with your family, that you aren't sure if you can get outside, then what happens is that your nervous system reacts. Every thought we have either sends a positive chemical to our brain, getting us closer to the cortex, or a negative one, every thought. So during times like a pandemic, there's a lot of negative thoughts that come in that just release cortisol and adrenaline. You might notice this when you all of a sudden can't sleep through the night, when you're having a harder time falling asleep, right? When you notice that you're more irritable, because it's just a sign that your nervous system is getting more flooded with more cortisol and more adrenaline. And so you have to be more intentional at doing things to calm the brain at the very top of our brain. So when we're working with our patients, we need to be responsive to their experiences too, because when we're saying, well, you know what your coping skills are, you know what you need to do, is we are living more in a limbic system. And so more people are becoming more reactive and more impulsive and more likely to engage in emotional behaviors. So we are seeing a higher increase in substance use. You are seeing people that are experimenting with gambling for the first time that they hadn't been before. So in order to be able to start to attend to coping skills, again, for ourselves as well as for our patients, we need to do more that will help us to activate the cortex at a higher rate. So when trauma sits with you, and we can argue that this pandemic is traumatic as an experience, so how trauma gets internalized, this doesn't mean that everybody's being diagnosed with PTSD. It means that when trauma sits with you, what happens is that those nervous systems start to come out of whack. So we have these two nervous systems, the cold system and the hot system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. Those two are supposed to balance. But when you are in a chronic state of prolonged stress, which is what we talked about, where you don't feel control, then resilience decreases and the vulnerability to other behaviors increases. So increases of substance use, of addictive behaviors, of depression or anxiety. So in order to be able to work towards getting the brain to be more balanced, we need to be more intentional to engage those parasympathetic nervous system so that it can balance it. So if we can just see this as, again, when you notice that you're more traumatized, when you're more irritable, when you're more, agitated or more depressed or more isolated, to just acknowledge that my nervous system is reacting, even if I'm not fully aware of it. So when I was mentioning that gentleman that was acknowledging that, I know the pandemic's going around, but I don't feel like it's really impacting me, is that if you notice that you're irritable, then can we just agree that your nervous system doesn't agree with your cortex? Can we just agree that we need to increase skills to help your cold system kick in so that you can find more balance and more rational thoughts? Because if you're feeling that you're out of control in regard to certain behaviors, then it just means that we need to enhance these skills. So when I talk about self-care, different than like everybody should do yoga. And again, not that there's anything wrong with yoga, because if people do it, it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. Doesn't work for me. So when I go to self-care and they're telling me all these things to do, I'm like, that doesn't really work for my personality. But I know things that work for me. And each and every one of us knows things that help us to feel better. It's, can you notice when you need to use them? So when you notice an increase in your nervous system arousal, this is the indicator that you need to start putting some deposits in there. When you notice you are more irritable and agitated, when you notice that you're having more difficulty managing emotions that you are normally accustomed to managing, when you find yourself lashing out either with family members or at work, when you feel more punitive towards your family or more frustrated with the people that you're working with, if you keep doing things that you later regret, that you're like, oh gosh, I should not have said that, right? So I should not have told my daughter not to chew so loudly. That was silly. She's 14 years old. She was just chewing cereal. I didn't regret it because I noticed it literally in the moment that I was like, my bad. I'm like, I'm not in a good space. I just need a couple minutes. If you notice increased sadness or feelings of loneliness, if you're enjoying life a little less, in order for us to be providers, we have to acknowledge this for ourselves. And you don't need to know why. So many times people are so concerned about figuring out the why. Well, why do I feel like this? I don't really think I'm impacted by the pandemic. I'll always say, pay attention to who you are. Because if you are an introvert, this is going to affect you a lot differently than if you are an extrovert. If you have been used to working 40, 50, 60 hours out of the house, this is going to feel very different than somebody that has worked less hours. If you have other stressors in your life, then your nervous system is already starting to change, and you don't need to know why to just acknowledge that it's happening, because then you're starting to stress about it. Like, I don't know why, this is so stupid. And we actually shame ourselves, which is an emotional part of our brain, which drops us further into that limbic system. So you don't need to know why. You just need to notice this. And if I notice this, I have the ability to then act. Hopefully this is making sense to everybody. So then how does this impact those that we are working with in regards to gambling? Under prolonged stress, as we talked about, many engage in new behaviors to try and cope. So here you have somebody that, again, whether they are an introvert or an extrovert, that maybe wouldn't have ordinarily gambled, that maybe wouldn't have gone to a casino or would not have done it. So when you think of introverts in that respect, they would never have done some of those things. That when they're sitting at home and they start to fall deeper into the limbic system, the reality is that if they started to do something online, if they started to do something, on their phones, and the accessibility, now they don't have the anxiety of being around other people, and they're immediately going to get some sense of a reward in their brain, right? So what I didn't mention before is that the emotional part of your brain has also the hippocampus, which retains memories. So it creates associated meanings. So if you were feeling really depressed and isolated, or just feeling depressed and bored, and you began online gambling because you were like, you know what, I see it on TV. There's the good news is that there's plenty of TV commercials. So in a horrible way that's happening is that they keep promoting is if you were like, you know what, I'm just going to try it. I mean, what else am I going to do? If you won, or you found it enjoyable, or you like the bells and the whistles, then what happens is it sends a message to the hippocampus saying, wow, you don't feel so depressed anymore. You should keep doing that. And then it becomes part of a behavior because you're still limbic systemly dominant. So the more enticing ways to gamble with the belief that gambling is a quick way of making money. So again, think about somebody that is panicking about not being able to feed their family or worrying about their job with this hope, right? So the anticipation of winning is just as rewarding to the brain as winning can be. So think about that. The anticipation, this is how this becomes so responsive to the brain, is because if you've won once, your brain starts to really anticipate this is going to be that one time. This is going to be it. And the anticipation can stimulate the brain in a way that mirrors what it feels like to win. And then afterwards, you don't feel the same because you didn't win, but your brain remembers the anticipation. The brain remembers the that you were feeling stressed and you were feeling anxious. And when you did that, the anticipation rewarded your brain with saying, "Ooh, gosh, this is so terrific." Right? So the brain's associating those positive experiences prior to if you didn't win. So that's how it reinforces it. And so again, there's this real danger of casual customers replacing their relatively limited sports betting or whatever they were doing to virtual games. because of the accessibility and because they have nothing else to do, so that if they feel or experience anxiety, depression, and they do this, it rewards them. So you want to have more questions for those that you're working with. You want to make sure and ask the right questions about whether or not they have been doing any of these things, and what does it feel like for them? And then what does it feel like right before you do this? That maybe somebody that didn't seem to be struggling with this in the past could be today. So with stay-at-home orders, we can see, again, the more boredom, stress, the depression, and again, that frequency at which gamblers can stake is the main reason for the high addiction numbers for these type of games, right? I always say it's similar, except it's similar to like substances, where when the dopamine reward is so great, right, that people, that's what the brain remembers. But think about just natural behaviors. If you've ever had a small child, that when you go to check out at the grocery store, right? Grocery stores are terrific at having all the like small gadgets and toys and candies right at the aisle. So if you've ever went with a small child, that child will ask for a gum, candy, please, please, please. If you cave once, then that behavior is much more difficult to extinguish, because the brain will associate that reward is worth the next 6 times that you go to the grocery store and we're told no. And so they might have a temper tantrum, they might be crying and screaming, but if you reward it once, the brain retains that as a win. And so this is what we're seeing for somebody that is already feeling stress, and a lot of people aren't acknowledging it. They're like, no, I'm fine, everything is good, I don't feel like it, but I'm just noticing that I'm more tired, I'm a little more irritable, but I'm sure I'm more irritable because I'm with my family. True, but we're noticing, again, a change in your nervous system. So this is an even more important time to begin screening, if you weren't already. So the interesting thing, again, in regards to how will we manage through these prolonged stressors, is that the first thing that normally happens is all of the self-care that we do that gets us through our day-to-day, right? And so if we're providers, we do our jobs day-to-day successfully. When stress happens in any prolonged state, the first thing we let go of are some of the self-care measures that we were using that helped us to keep ourselves regulated. So we change our diet, all of a sudden we're craving, and again, the irony is that everybody's talking about the quarantine diet, right? So you're going to come out of here 15 to 20 pounds heavier, case in point, right? So because you're eating more salts and sugars than maybe you would, that it's a way that you are managing your diet. That there's a change in your exercise and a lack of being able to be outside, that you're changing your connection. So you might feeling an increase in the isolation. That for casual, substance use, we're seeing an increase in that people are having, quarantinis and virtual happy hours, that these casual experiences of substance use, similar to the casual experiences of gambling, are increasing, but they're increasing during our more vulnerable physiological states, which then increase our risks for it becoming problematic. That the self-care things that we used to do, we don't do as much. So that's the interesting dynamic, is that as we get more stressed, we actually let go of most of our self-care preventative measures as the first line of defeat of giving it up. And that's where you need to be more attentive, even more during these times. So I always like to say, sometimes it's just about changing your perspective. So everybody has different feelings in regards to their own ability and what their resilience looks like and what their self-care looks like. But I always say, just changing your perspective makes a difference. And so this was a wonderful quote by Mr. Rogers. So for some of you who maybe are not old enough, you wouldn't know who that was, unless you saw the Tom Hanks movie. But a wonderful quote: when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say for me to look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. That is the change in the brain state. She certainly didn't know that back then, or maybe she did, but it's a change in brain state. So you can ingest more stress, which is going to trigger more of that hot system, limbic system responses. Or when you change your perspective and you find the helpers, that elicits cortex. When you find all of the people that are providing meals for our first responders, when you look for the helpers, the general kindness of people, on a day-to-day, those actions elicit responses in the cold system of the brain, the parasympathetic nervous system. So I like to say pain is certain, but suffering is optional. So we can't have two emotions at the same time. So I'm not minimizing it. And again, there's different circumstances that if I was talking about trauma, I'd be talking about this in a much more complex manner. But pain is certain. This is what life is at times. Suffering, where it becomes prolonged, is where we start to be able to learn where we can gain control. I can't control the pain that I might experience because I can't predict the future. But I can start to learn how to control my suffering. I can start to learn and acknowledge when I feel it so that I can put these deposits to help activate that part of my nervous system. That's what I can do. So I have to create balance. So today and in the future, be attentive to what's important at the time, right? So figuring out these moments, again, being aware of whether you are an introvert or an extrovert. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of these skills. So we have about 10 more minutes, I believe. Let me look. Yeah, about 10 more minutes. So I want to make sure that I'm highlighting some of this. I know somebody had asked if the slides will be available. They will be. And so I'm happy to answer any questions. But when we're in that prolonged stress response, the alarm keeps ringing, right? That's where our brain states start to shift, where it's no longer balanced, where we're in the hot system more than the cold system. And that's where we acknowledge and feel those symptoms, the depression, the anxiety, the irritability, the agitation, the feeling tired. So when we are activated, we aren't able to access the rational part of our brains, right? So the more activated we are, the harder it is for us to be rational. And we can feel that, right? Because we say things that we are like, I shouldn't have said that. Because we acknowledge that we're like, why am I feeling so stressed? Like, this is ridiculous. When you start feeling yourself, shaming yourself for an emotion, you are already out of your cortex. So that's a moment that you go, oh, I'm making myself feel bad for feeling bad. So I'm no longer going to judge it because it doesn't work. That's not how my brain works. I'm actually going to just do things to help calm my nervous system down. Because then when you do, you actually can get to the cortex to be able to rationally think yourself through it. So self-regulation is incredibly important. So when I talk about self-care, I'm actually more talking about self-regulation. So if yoga is your thing, terrific. Yoga pisses me off, I don't do it. So it doesn't regulate my system. So self-regulation is an important piece. And so it can either happen from the top of the brain down or the bottom of the brain up. So what are those two differences? The top-down approaches are those that require a lot of self-talk. If you are very minimally triggered, then you actually can talk yourself out of it. When you are working with a client and they are minimally triggered, meaning they're at the tippy top of their limbic system, so close to their cortex, then you can use skills like the pros and the cons, that you can use self-talk, like I know I can do this, right? I could acknowledge myself that, you know what, Trish, you're having a bad day. You just told your daughter to stop chewing her cereal. You got to take a moment. So self-talk is a really good regulation skill, but it doesn't work the further you are in the limbic system. So when you have clients who are incredibly triggered and having very strong urges, if your majority of your skills that you're giving them are self-talk, just think about your future. Just think about what would happen if you did that. Think about what will happen in your marriage. Don't you want to have that? Self-talk will actually create shame because they're too far in the limbic system. Self-talk only works when you are minimally triggered. If somebody broke into your house, you would be very triggered, right? You would drop all the way down to the brain state. And you would not use self-talk of like, oh my gosh, I wonder if somebody's really in my house. I wonder if somebody broke in. You would act very reactively, very impulsively to save your life. So the bigger the trigger and the further you are down in that limbic system, you need to start using the bottom-up approaches because they work in the opposite direction. So soothing the lower parts of the brain first can help you to bring to that thinking part of your brain back online, which becomes inaccessible to us when we are very triggered. And so again, I always say, think about if you were about to get killed by a bear. If you were killed by a bear, or if you were about to, you would not want your chatty cortex reasoning with you about like what you need to do. I wonder if you should run, or do you want to play dead? Like, how do you want to do this whole thing? You don't want the cortex a part of it. So that is not effective. You are dropping all the way down to the bottom of your brainstem, and you are either going to fight or flight. That's what you're going to do immediately, because if it doesn't work that way, we don't survive. So these are survival parts of our brain. And so you start to recognize. So, and somebody had asked, so how do I know if I'm really irritable? And I go, well, how often are you irritable in the day? If you find yourself agitated all day long, then you're pretty far down in the limbic system. So you need to do some self-care. If you're just every once in a while feeling irritable, but you're able to talk yourself out of it, then continue to do self-talk, continue to do the bottom or the top down. So when we're looking at what top-down regulation is, because our stress response system recalibrates moment to moment. So that's a really important thing, because sometimes people will say, I used a coping skill, it didn't work. Great. It recalibrates moment to moment. Small amounts of self-regulation throughout the day are far more effective to your brain than one large chunk. So the good news is that when people say you have to get your nails done for self-care, or you need to go on a vacation, and you're like, man, those are not accessible to me. The good news is that what research is actually saying is that because your brain recalibrates moment to moment, those small deposits are actually more effective. So these little tiny things that you can do 3 to 5 minutes throughout the entirety of your day are more effective at calming your nervous system. That's terrific for us to know about ourselves. It's also incredibly helpful for our patients to know, so that they don't overwhelm themselves thinking they need to do some kind of grand thing to take care of themselves better. So the therapeutic dose requires to signal change to calm the nervous system, 3 to 5 minutes. So if you know you have to do something will increase your stress, try to schedule self-regulation beforehand. So if you had to do, if webinars, which they are not, but if webinars are very stressful, then I would do something for myself right beforehand. I might breathe, or I might take a walk right beforehand. That if you know you're about to do something stressful, give yourself 3 to 5 minutes to regulate. If it was stressful and you got through it, but you were like, oh, it wasn't that bad, I'm going to recommend you still regulate. So again, when I worked with somebody that has he'll say he has a bad temper, and he was reaching out to me saying, I'm really triggered right now. That what I did is said, so what are you going to do in this moment to get your brain regulated first? So you can watch a funny movie. And so these everyday solutions, right? And I was asked once, and that's what that quote was. So what do you do to regulate, right? To self-care. And everybody on the panel had to answer. And some people were saying, oh, I don't really take care of myself. I don't really do that. And what I had said is, I don't have the luxury not to. I work in a field where I am responsible to be able to hold the pain of other people. And if I'm not regulated, I will get triggered, and then I won't be able to be present for them. So I take this really seriously, because it's important for me to be able to take care of myself in order to be able to be more effective with them. And so these subtle things, anticipate your own fatigue or your own irritability so that you can compensate. So if you notice it, you need to deposit it, and then you need to act, right? So for me, 2 things that I'd done that were incredibly different, changing for me, these subtle deposits, even now, right? So in the pandemic, as I said, I travel a lot for my job, and now I'm home all the time, is the time by myself is incredibly important. And so I've started watching Jimmy Fallon, because he's silly, because he's funny, because he makes me laugh, and because what it does is it changes my physiology. That it's a deposit in my emotional piggy bank to calm my nervous system. That if you are watching very stressful shows, then that will actually increase the physiology. So pay attention to what you are watching. And I think we're going to talk about that. So managing the balance from the bottom up. So sleep is going to do that. Exercise is going to do that. Doesn't mean you have to be at a gym. It just means you're walking, or you're walking up and down your own stairs. Diet plays a significant, when you notice you are craving more salts, more sugars, more carbs, then it is an indication that your brain is saying, we are feeling low. Those foods increase serotonin and dopamine at rates that are much higher than normal foods. And so what it does is it spikes it, and then you'll notice that you drop down. So it's more intentional. I'm not telling people that they can't eat sweets, because I'd be offended if somebody told me to do that. I'm saying be more intentional. Don't eat the sweet when you're craving it. Eat the sweet just because you enjoy it. So notice the difference. Increasing those positive experiences, a cold glass of water. If you find yourself very irritable, go get a cold glass of water, because it will automatically calm your nervous system. Period. A distraction, so walking around the house. I've had people that, again, because they are cooped up and they're, feeling overwhelmed and they can feel the buildup, they've been running up and down their stairs just to exert some of that energy. Mindfulness is an incredibly adaptive, an important way to start calming that brain down and becoming aware of the moment, so that you're not worrying about the past or anxious about the future. Staying connected and not isolating. Breathing is huge. Just breathing. If you've never looked at different ways to breathe, I would really recommend that, even if all you do is just take a normal breath in and exhale all the way out. If you stretched your body, if you rolled your shoulders, these are ways to activate that change in your brain chemistry. Outdoors and laughter. Laughter is one of the best things that you can do to reset your brain. So in that resetting the caliber, if you are angry or cranky or depressed, watch something funny, because you can't help it. If your brain laughs, it can't be sad and laughing at the same time. Can't have two emotions at the same time. And then everyday strategies to manage the top-down approaches, particularly when we're looking at COVID-19. And then this is going to be one of my last slides, and I'm going to have Josh jump back in. So stay informed, but not too much. You should not be watching the news all day long about COVID-19, but check out one news. Whoever you like, watch them for a half an hour. Find distractions that you enjoy and do it. Find the helpers. Monitor your diet. Find different ways to enhance your spirituality. Find alternative things to do with your families, which we had mentioned before, even if that's 10 minutes. Find new ways to connect to others, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. Pay attention to which ways work best for you. Choose your TV wisely. So what I tell people all the time that are feeling irritable, that are feeling their anxiety, don't watch stressful shows before you go to bed. It takes about 4 hours for adrenaline to come through your system. And so if you're watching Speed, or if you're watching Die Hard, or I obviously don't watch a ton, so I don't know any great movies, then the adrenaline that you feel in the moment, it takes 4 hours for it to come back out of your system. So watch something that's funny, watch something that you just enjoy, but don't watch highly adrenaline seeking TV before you go to bed. That's why I watch Jimmy Fallon before I go to bed. And give yourself permission to survive. And then gratitude. Again, gratitude is one of the most fundamental ways that they have linked to changing neural circuitry. When you intentionally seek out gratitude, even in the midst of some of the hardest days, it forces your brain to use different neural circuitry, that the more you do it, the stronger it gets. And that helps to offset your nervous system. So I am going to end on that. I'm going to bring Josh back in so that he can wrap up and let you know what you need to do for your credits. And please feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you might have. I'm happy to provide my email address if that would be helpful.